Hello. Buen Camino. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to this number 4 in our series of practical Pilgrim webinars hosted by Camino Pilgrim at the Confraternity of St James, UK. As ever, I am Freddie, the CSJ General Manager, and I will be your host for the evening. Please feel free to submit any questions to us via the Q&A button throughout tonight's webinar, and we will respond to as many of them as we can at the end. If we don't get around to you, we're very sorry, but we will make sure that you get an answer emailed out to you. This time, we will be hearing about the slightly mysterious and ephemeral phenomenon that is Jacobean Holy Years from Reverend Colin Jones, who joins us this evening from his home and parish in the West Midlands. Given the effects of last year, you would be forgiven for forgetting that we are in fact in a Holy Year. And now, of course, will be until the end of 2022. But what does that mean? Why is it different? And why is it special? Well, as a pilgrim, hospitalero trainer, working reverend, and Holy Year enthusiast, who is more qualified to demystify us than our very own chairman? Colin, welcome.
Hello. Good to be with you and all of our fellow pilgrims this evening, or whenever you will be joining us. I will attempt to further mystify you all about what a Holy Year is, because although it's a deceptively simple question, what is a Holy Year, and what does it mean to be a pilgrim in a Holy Year, as always, these things are a little more complex than we first think. If you were to look at the huge and ever-growing range of material that is published about the Camino, whether it is literature, guidebooks, whether it's on the internet and YouTube, vlogs and blogs, you could be forgiven thinking that somehow the Camino is something upon which, rather like a blank canvas, we can project whatever we wish, whether it's from a deeply religious experience all the way through to a cheap tourist holiday and everything in between. However, it's not like that. In truth, the Camino is rather like a rich portrait. It has complexities and depths that have been built up over time. And that allows us to either look at the big picture or to focus on small details within the picture. And the Holy Year is one of those details of a bigger picture. If we were to say to most people who have a passing interest in the Camino, what exactly is a Holy Year? I'm guessing that they would say, rather brightly, a Holy Year is when the 25th of July, which is the patronal feast of St. James, and therefore the cathedral, when the 25th of July coincides with a Sunday. And given the calendar and the rather peculiar way in which we unfold our calendar, that means it is irregular in the sense that it is 1165 years and then it repeats itself, unless of course it falls in within a millennium, in which case it changes once more. However, that merely tells you what and when a Holy Year is, not what it is, what it consists of, what does it feel like. It only tells us when it occurs, these years. So what is a Holy Year? If it is more than a date? Well, the best place to start, I think, and I'm now going to share some slides with you, is of course the cathedral website. If you go to the cathedral website, it has some very helpful information for pilgrims and what to do when you arrive at cathedral, but also a very, very concise explanation of what a Holy Year is. And its first title is A Holy Year of Jubilee. A Holy Year of Jubilee. You'll also notice that it's not simply 1 year. This is now a unique experience for all of us, that it extends over 2 years, 2021, 2022. So, to pose a question, which you may or may not be able to answer at the end of my talk, is it a holy year or should it be holy years in plural? Well, what does the cathedral website say about the Holy Year? It says that a Compostela Holy Year, to distinguish it from other holy years, is a period when the Church grants singular spiritual graces to the faithful, imitating what the Bible says regarding the Jubilee year to the Israelites. And then it quotes a verse from the Old Testament book Leviticus, chapter 25. It does mention that it began in the year 1122 when Pope Calixtus II confirmed that there should be a holy year, and then later, about 50 years later, another pope granted the pattern that we now know of 11, 6, 5, 6 years, and so on. But what does the time of spiritual grace really mean? What are they talking about when they say that? What is so special about a holy year that it marks it off from any other year in which pilgrims arrive at the cathedral? Well, it says that the graces, those are God's gifts to the faithful, are in exchange for what the pilgrims do. They have to visit the tomb of the apostle in the cathedral, and they have to say a prayer. They also have to receive the sacrament of confession and also receive communion. Now, these don't have to be done on the same day, but they have to be done fairly near to the pilgrim's entrance into the cathedral. If you do this, you gain an indulgence, but it's not an indulgence for you. It's an indulgence, a favor that is for someone who is deceased. Now that will give a little clue about the origins of a holy year. It is, in fact, a way in which we can pray for those who have died and also, therefore, earn remission from time in purgatory. You also have to say Our Father and Creed and so on. If you like your worldview, if you like your view of the way in which we live life, nice and neat, this is really, really good, because it is something in which we do, we gain experience, and we exchange our experience for God's gift. And it's very clear about how we do it, and it is very clear about what we receive in return. But notice one or two things. First of all, there's no mention of the Holy Door, of which we saw televised the great opening on the 31st of December last year. In fact, it's not necessary to go through the Holy Door in order to gain this extraordinary grace, this indulgence for those who have died. Also, if you like your history and your theology and biblical theology particularly nice and neat and clear, this is the place to go. However, it should also be read in the light of the Archbishop's pastoral letters. Now, this is also an extraordinary time because normally the Archbishop of Compostela issues one pastoral letter at the beginning of a Holy Year to help people interpret a little more fully about pilgrimage and about going to the cathedral. It is extraordinary because he has issued a second one, and I will come back, I will return to that second one later. But the first one is about how do we approach the question of coming to the cathedral, coming to the tomb of the Apostle James. And it's very much, as you would expect, it's a call to leave your home, to travel, to be in a different place, to have different experiences, because from this perspective, we begin to see our lives in a different way. We may even begin to see God's call within it, because sometimes, as the Archbishop says, we are bogged down by the regularity of daily life. But by leaving that regularity, we begin to see things afresh. And so it's a time of renewal. It's a time in which we can have personal spiritual renewal, but also renewal in our relationships with others, time to repair them, and also time to repair our relationship with God. This is pretty much in line with all preceding pastoral letters issued by the cathedral and the Archbishop prior to a Holy Year. It's a way in which they are able to draw in, if you like, those who are not practicing Roman Catholics. Because one of the objections you may have to the interpretation of a Holy Year as the cathedral website has laid it out, it's really quite a niche thing. It's for those who are practicing Roman Catholics. Because note, if you can't receive communion, if you can't receive the sacrament of confession, you can't actually receive the special graces that are on offer. So the second objection you may want to say is, hang on a moment, there doesn't seem to be much about the Camino in all this. And you'd be right, because it's very clear that the Jubilee favor of a Holy Year and the pilgrimage are not linked to the granting of a Compostela, which now has become increasingly the main way in which people view the Camino. It's the Camino. And how many times have people said or written about or produced blogs saying, you know, it is the Camino experience. And therefore, it is the Camino that has the properties of regenerating, restoring, on giving us that other dimension to our lives. Well, that means, of course, that rather than the cathedral, it looks more like the Pilgrim Office has become the end point of people's Camino. And the cathedral is a sort of add-on to that. It's something you can do once you've got your Compostela. In truth, of course, it does point that increasingly over the last decades, it's as though the Camino has sort of broken free from the cathedral and the tomb of St. James, and has now acquired a life of its own and a dynamic life of its own, in which people find it more easy to insert themselves within the Camino than they do at the arrival point of the cathedral. And that would not be unfair, because it is clear that the cathedral is concentrating on a particular religious interpretation of the Holy Year. So it sounds quite exclusive in many ways, but clearly since the 80s, the overwhelming experience of people on the Camino is more of traveling, journeying, meeting others than it is of spiritual or religious experience. And this is where something else comes in, the Anno Jacobeo. Now, the Anno Jacobeo is something that runs parallel and overlaps in many ways with the Holy Year. But to understand what it is and why it is similar but not the same, we need to look at where it came from. Its first experience, its first publication into the world was in fact the Jacobeo 93. Now, it's Jacobeo because it is a Gallego word. So it's Jacobeo. And that gives a clue about its origins. 1993 was a holy year. And about a couple of years before that, the Junta de Galicia created a separate entity called the Jacobeo. The Jacobeo was charged with the responsibility of creating a program of activities for the year 1993. It also was charged with paying attention to pilgrims, particularly in Galicia, and therefore improving the provision of services. Prior to 1993, it was particularly the building of albergues for pilgrims to stay in, and also to ensure that it was promoted, particularly the Camino Frances, beyond the borders of Galicia. And indeed, the Anno Jacobeo begins to grow in the imagination of other regions of Spain, and has also become a handy way in which talking about the activities for Holy Year. When you look at the description of the Jacobeo, and particularly the creation of Anno Jacobeo for 1993, you will see it explicitly says that it is a civil program, not a religious program. It is a civil cultural program. It is explicitly meant to be a counterweight to the hitherto then religious program that dominated the particular holy years. Why is this the case? Well, it's a little bit of history here. Spain is emerging from the Franco regime. The autonomous regions are beginning to find their own political culture. The breaking free from the past will mean also breaking free from the heavy predominance, or the perceived heavy predominance, of the Roman Catholic Church. And so there is a political desire to create something as a counterweight to for the church calling the shots, and particularly because by promoting the Camino, promoting particularly the Camino Frances, it becomes a way in which more and more people can be attracted to the Camino, but without having to agree or sign up to its a religious interpretation. It is interesting that Elias, who was famously responsible for marking out the Camino Frances, and particularly with yellow arrows, did so not simply to prevent the historic route from being lost to memory, but really as a counter to the ever-growing secular interpretation of the Camino, and particularly it as a tourist route and a motorist's tourist route. And so he wanted to create something that was an alternative to this ever growing secular interpretation of the Camino. So the first Anno Jacobeo is 1993, and since then it has grown, particularly because it contributes phenomenally to the Galician economy and also to the economies or villages, towns, cities all along the Camino Frances, and also now other routes that move into Galicia from other directions. So what are the pros and cons of an Anno Jacobeo? Well, it allows more people to experience the Camino, for whatever that may be for them, rather than having a narrow religious interpretation, which may be a put off. After all, it is better that people experience this and find out for themselves, rather than having an interpretation put upon them. It's also recognizing a new type of pilgrimage, the pilgrimage that really is about exploring oneself, exploring other cultures, societies, meeting other people, and discovering as it evolves, rather than beginning the Camino, your pilgrimage, with a particular view. That view being, of course, that you're going to visit, pray at the tomb of St. James the Apostle. It also has the advantage of increasing investment in the Caminos in a way that, if left to individual organizations and associations, municipalities, and so on, it would be quite random. The Jacobeo has inspired other regions to have a much more coordinated view, planned view of services for the Caminos. So in fact has really helped and improved the infrastructure. But there are counterweights to this. It can be seen as too secular. My Camino, my experience, rather than the communal experience of spirituality or religious faith. It also could be said it becomes too regulated. A concern for ever improving facilities, ever higher standards offered at albergues and other places, means that the Junta Jacobeo are really concerned about standards of accommodation and safety. After all, it only takes one fire at an albergue to gain a bad reputation for the Camino. Hence, of course, the ever-increasing impulse to make things the same standard as though we were still at home. Those of you who may have been on the Camino in the early 90s and later will remember that it was quite all right to sleep on the floor. Now it's not, because there are safety issues involved. So it feels a lot more regulated. Also, it isn't a criticism. The Anno Jacobeo now begins to look a little more to money regulated. It's about orientation, about earning income. In many ways, of course, Galicia and other regions in the north of Spain really do need this income. And we will come back to that in this second pastoral letter of the Archbishop. So the Anno Jacobeo, a secular counterweight to the religious Holy Year, but it also overlaps and runs parallel to, and there are clear conversations between the cathedral and the Jacobeo about coordinating their programs. And so we have now this double sense, 2021 or 2022 now, with its logo, particular logo now, the Camino Santiago, an event of exceptional public interest on one side, but on the other side, Jacobeo Annual Santo, Holy Year. So we have in that one image, of course, the pilgrimage, but that sense in which the religious aspect and, if you like, the more secular aspect are touching each other, but run in parallel. Some of you may remember, of course, this little mascot from the first Anno Jacobeo, a slightly odd figure. He's meant to be, he was created for 1993 and has revived for the current Holy Year, but in a slightly different form. In 1993, this was his form, that's on the left-hand side, and he appeared all over the place. And I did find a photograph of a rather bedraggled looking and not particularly well done sculpture of the 1993 Pilgrim, looking very, very bedraggled now and worse for wear. But is this all that we can say about the Holy Year? Well, no, there's a lot more really we need to think about. And it means looking a little bit, without too many dates, at history and a little bit at theology. Now, if you like your history in nice straight lines, with dates marching one after the other, look away now and make a cup of tea or coffee, and you'll be happy. Come back in about 5 or so minutes, because history, I'm afraid, isn't quite as neat as that. When the cathedral website says that the first of the Holy Years was in 1112, it may be right, or it may not be wholly right. And the problem is, the question is, what was it that happened in 1122? Because we don't really know. There may have been something called a Holy Year. What it consisted of, if it did take place, we don't know. And the reason it's not very clear is because the only reference to it is in a passage in the rolls of Alfonso VII, which may have been put in later as an interpretation of events that were unfolding in the kingdom, i.e. the mass pilgrimage to Santiago. If it did take place, what was it? Well, we just don't know. It may have been just one day. This is the special day. Sunday is the 25th of July, and therefore this is declared to be of particular holiness, particular sanctity. But certainly within 50 years, we have a much more systematic approach to the Holy Year. We still don't know what the Holy Year consisted of, other than the fact it is now taking place on a much more regular basis, the ones that we are used to, 11, 6, 5 years, and so on. Why? Why would you want a Holy Year? If arriving at the tomb of the apostle, the first apostle to be martyred, and praying, wins for you a powerful intercessor in the courts of heaven, then surely it doesn't really matter when you do it, and it doesn't particularly matter if it's deemed a special year. Well, it may have something to do with an increasing desire for administration to tidy things up, to make sure that we know exactly when a holy year is taking place. So it doesn't sort of take place when the Archbishop wakes up one morning, claps his hands and says, I know, we'll have a holy year next year. So it becomes much more predictable, much more obvious and clear about its progression. But also other things are taking place which may have been the cause of creating holy years. Several things taking place simultaneously. The first is the rebuilding of the cathedral is going great guns. And this is a picture of what the cathedral may have looked like towards the end of the 12th century as the works begin to draw to a close. It may be that there is a need to say that if you're going to come to the cathedral, this is a particularly important year to do it in. It marks it out as a year of grace. But special grace, well, we'll come to that in a bit. Why would this be an important event in the life, not only the cathedral, but also the kingdom? Because, of course, more and more pilgrims are arriving at the cathedral. So it is marking this out as a prime pilgrimage center. It's marking it out not as above and of greater importance than other local pilgrimages. It's important to remember that the pilgrimage to Santiago begins as a popular religious event. No one told people to go there on pilgrimage. No one told people that they were to seek out the tomb. They did it. And as in often the case, the church then has to come in later and try and make sense of this. And they make sense of it by saying that actually going to the tomb of the apostle is important because you can be assured that your prayers are heard in the courts of heaven, because the apostle, the first to be martyred, is a powerful intercessor. It's also at a time when the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula are beginning to feel that they are perhaps on an edge. Only a few years before, the Caliphate of Cordoba was proclaimed. You have to remember, we're still talking about just a couple of generations before the sack of Santiago by al-Mansur. It does feel as though everything is slightly precarious. And so this politically, it's important to have a place that says, look, this is a focus for our faith. Our faith is important because it underwrites the existence of our kingdom. Without our faith, without this place, it wouldn't make much sense in maintaining our kingdoms. That's what they're about. But there's something else going on, which will come to fruition perhaps within a couple of centuries, and that is the concept of purgatory. Now, at this point, in the 12th century, it's still beginning to grow, but there is a sense in which people feel that if salvation is not a done deal on earth, it's something which we progress towards, and it is confirmed in heaven through the resurrection, then surely that progress to the gift of eternal life must continue in death itself. if it's not finished on earth. So this idea that somehow there is a purification of those on the pilgrimage of faith that is on earth, but also continues to begins to grow and comes to its fruition, primarily in the 14th and 15th centuries, which is where perhaps the Holy Year begins to get its characteristic sense of the gift of a particular grace, the indulgences. Now, interestingly, the first record of this is about the year 1300, and it may be to do with a political event rather than a spiritual one. We forget that the archbishops of Santiago were prince bishops. They had lands to look after, defend in the name of the king or against the king, and also they had to get money in to keep the works going, so to speak. And they were particularly good at this. They were given lands, but they also raised taxes. Now, at one point, there was a revolt of the good merchants of the city of Compostela. They didn't like paying heavy taxes, and they raised an army in revolt, closed the gates, and locked the archbishop out of the city. Well, in the end, he won. But of course, if you're going to get the taxes in, you want sort of willing people who are going to be sort of on your side. So he fully forgave all those who had been in revolt against them. And he used the Holy Year to give a full remission of earthly offences, which rather chimed in with this idea of purgatory. Now, the first fully documented Holy Year, interestingly, where we know exactly what happened liturgically and also in the life of the cathedral, how they organized the cathedral to cope with so many pilgrims, was as late as 1434. And the reason we know that is because there were the giving of safe conducts to non-Castilians to arrive at the cathedral, which also include, interesting, within that year, 3,000 British people who arrived, or from the British Isles, arrived by boat. Now, of course, all of this begins to wane in the 18th and particularly in the 19th centuries. And indeed, by the latter quarter of the 19th century, the Holy Years were there just essentially in name. Very few pilgrims came. It was something that was in the calendar, but it didn't particularly have a strong sense in which this was a really important event until the rediscovery of the remains of the apostle. But even then, it required the Archbishop of Santiago to make it compulsory for the diocesan clergy to go on pilgrimage. They didn't have to walk, they could go on horseback or donkey or whatever, to go on pilgrimage during a Holy Year. He really had to work hard to stir up the imagination. And here we have a slide of this man, Archbishop Berenguel de Landoira. He is the one who first gave that indulgence, total indulgence. Then we begin this progress towards Holy Years appearing. And a little later, I'm going to show you some postage stamps that reflect this. But these are things that are born out of the Franco regime. Now, the Franco regime was particularly good at harnessing things that were traditional for their political use. The Catholic Church was one of those things it harnessed, and Holy Years were also one of those things that they harnessed. But again, they didn't have a particular religious flavor. They were there and they promoted tourism more than anything. And indeed, if you wanted to know about the Camino, right up and perhaps until the 80s, you went to the tourist board and they would produce this map for you, which said, this is the Camino, and this is where you can drive along. Holy Years didn't particularly get a look in, but bit by bit, as the taint of the Franco regime begins to slip away, people realize there is an interest in the wider world in cultural events. And so, trying to shake free of the Franco interpretation of a Holy Year, we have the Junta de Galicia and the cathedral beginning in the 80s to reimagine what a Holy Year could be. And for the cathedral, that was a reimagining of its theological roots. And here they bring in the Jubilee, which they refer to in Leviticus. But it's not quite as simple as that. In fact, it's quite odd to use Leviticus as your root and basis for a Jubilee. Why? Well, it is true that Leviticus talks about the remission of debts in order to renew and regenerate the people and the land. But the purpose of Leviticus is not about leaving your land and going to another place. It's about rooting people on the land, making sure that people are observing the laws and statutes laid down by the Lord God of Israel, that guarantees, that binds God, people, and land together. The purpose of the Jubilee is to ensure the safety of the land, to root people in the land. And so to use it as a way of describing a reason in which you may wish to leave your land and come on pilgrimage to another place is interesting theologically. But it does tie in the idea of pilgrimage with the New Testament, which talks completely about here we have no abiding city. Here, in many senses, what we experience is contingent and incomplete. So we now come to the question of why a double Holy Year? Why two? Well, it wasn't intended to be so, clearly. What happened is something which erupted into the world in late 2019 and spread quickly across the face of the globe. That is the pandemic. The Camino, the pilgrimage, has faced pandemics before, Black Deaths, smallpox, all these others before. And in those times, people just didn't do the pilgrimage. It was a fact of life. It was a way in which people understood things operated. But in the 20th century, late 20th century, we have tended to assume that everything needs to be regular, needs to be tied up neatly, needs to be certain. And so we plan for the Holy Year 2021. The confraternity had been planning for some years its events, all of which, of course, have gone out of the window because of the pandemic. And it was right up until the last moment that the concession was given by Pope Francis that the Holy Year should be extended from 2021 into the whole of the 2022. Is it a double Holy Year? No, it's not. Because although in the secular calendar, it is 2 years, in the church's way of calculating time, which is very different, 1 year can become nearly 800 days. It's about, as the cathedral website says, it's a period. So it's not 2 years, it's a holy year, which consists of two secular years. But what difference will it make of being on the Camino, if we are allowed to, during a double holy year? Well, this is where the Archbishop's second pastoral letter to pilgrims comes into play. It's a much sharper and a much more focused pastoral letter. There are not so many generalities in it. It really does address the question of the sadness and the suffering of people because of the pandemic. And that's not simply those who have caught the illness and those who are grieving for those who have died, but the economic suffering that this has caused. And economics is a fact of life, and it has destroyed the livelihoods of many, let alone overturn the hopes and expectations of those who had intended to go on pilgrimage beyond the Camino in 2021. So the Archbishop says that this is going to be a jubilee marked by our awareness of sadness and suffering, but also, and importantly, vulnerability. There is a frailty to our lives and our plans and expectations that the crisis we are living through has revealed, and which therefore will give the Camino a different dimension than had the crisis, had the pandemic not occurred. And indeed, he also says, of course, there is a spiritual loss as well, because people have not been able to go on pilgrimage. Churches have been closed, and for Roman Catholics, the Eucharist Mass has not been celebrated. So what he asks is that if we are on the Camino, if we do arrive at the cathedral during this holy year, then we should do so with a greater sense of human frailty and humility, and take that our plans are, as always, contingent, and that our human condition is not as certain and as robust as we had thought. And that this isn't just simply about me and the upset of my expectations, but it reveals a global frailty, that we are united in our frailty. He therefore asks that if we are able to go on the Camino, then we use it far more creatively than we would have done without the pandemic. That is, to look with compassionate eyes at ourselves, at other pilgrims, at those who we will encounter on the Camino, hospitaleros, shops, and so on, deeply marked by the pandemic and the suffering that is caused. In other words, it's really an appeal to break out of the my Camino syndrome, whereby we are doing this for my experience, my benefit. And he says it's a challenge. Use this as a challenge to reinterpret reality and the experiences that we have. But also, of course, it is still a time of grace and reconciliation with God, with each other. It is an opportunity, in other words, to open our hearts and our eyes to the sufferings of others and not be immune to them or insensible to them. And he suggests perhaps to engage with the Camino during the Holy Year with also a deep sense of gratitude to those who have worked unremittingly for the good of all during the pandemic. That's not only the health services, it's the scientific background, it's the political structures that have worked in order to ensure that the pandemic, the COVID-19, is not as devastating as first feared. So he says, from this, we can build the Holy Year into a sort of field hospital in which we recover our sense of social solidarity, our sense in which we are supported by far greater things than we first suspected. One of the problems I think that people encounter, and particularly if you're a hospitalero, you will be aware of, that pilgrims can take for granted what is provided because they are so concerned about their experience, they forget sometimes that this has been provided by others, that they could not possibly do the Camino without the support, often invisible support, of others. So he ends by saying, let the pilgrimage be a sign, but also a question. A holy year is a sign that somehow there is a special reason to venture out into the world with fresh eyes. There is also good reason to do so in hope. But, he says, let us not be fooled into thinking we are going to return to the way that things were. It's not like that. We will have to move forward and see it as it is. And so, what have we got for a Holy Year? Well, it's a reminder, it's a special call that there are other dimensions to life and indeed the Camino than just simply historic, cultural, or a pastime. There are religious, spiritual, and cultural dimensions that add something different to the way in which we do things. It is a reminder, the Holy Year is a reminder of it is communal. Its existence is because of a wider church recognizing that there is something important about this particular place, this particular time. It also is about reminding us there is a variety in which we can do the Camino and we can experience our pilgrimage. In that sense, the existence of the Holy Year is a corrective to the modern tendency to make things psychological, egocentric, and secular. Not that they're bad, they're all part of being human, but there are other ways, other dimensions in which human beings can be transformed. Now, we're going to end by looking at a set of stamps. And these are stamps from various years. Fortunately, most of them do have a year on. And just have a look, you can choose which one you like best, but just have a look at how they are entitled. So 1937 and so on, it's the Año Jubilar Compostelano, definitely in Castilian. It's the Holy Year, and the images are very, very traditional. We see that focus on the traditional figure of the, not portrayed in a very conventional way, of the pilgrim and also of the cathedral as St. James. So all well and good. So you can guess that this comes really from the shadow of the Franco regime. But we begin to break out. This is 1985 and a little more jolly. We have quite a jolly Could be Santiago, could be a pilgrim, definitely a pilgrim in the two Pesetas. And then we have now, interestingly, a figure of the map of the Camino. The Camino now is beginning to edge into consciousness, not simply St. James, not simply the cathedral. And so we come to 1993, and here Jacobean comes in, 1993. So that double thing of the Holy Year and the Anno Jacobean, and some rather startling postage stamps that later emerged, avant-garde, one could almost say. We come back to slightly more conventional ones for 1999, but note, these now become much more cultural. They are figuring places, monuments you will see along the Camino. And we have, of course, the logo of the Anno Jacobean beginning to appear on the stamps. So you begin to see how things are moving. 2010, cathedral silhouette. Notice now, it's a real pilgrim. It's not an idealized vision of a pilgrim, it's a real pilgrim, and of course, another bit of the cathedral. I would love to have brought you the stamps, Spanish stamps, Correo stamps, for 2021. However, I don't think they've been issued. What has been issued is a first day cover. And the first day cover is when you buy a special envelope, you buy the stamps, the special stamps, and on the day they're issued, you get them posted and they get a special franc on it and so on. I think what's happened is that they've withdrawn the stamps in order to redesign them to reflect its 2021-2022. So we're going to end with the Holy Door, La Puerta Santa. And just a reminder, it is not actually essential to come in through that door in a Holy Year. But why does it exist? Why is it only opened, on the whole, in Holy Year? Well, the first mention we have of the door, this door, is in fact in the mid-15th century. And this may be something to do with the work that is taking place at the other end of the cathedral. Lots of work is taking place. The facade is being renewed, and the Holy Doors may have come into play as an alternative entrance for pilgrims. And that sort of becomes the idea, the symbol. We'll only use this door now. We don't need to use it all the time. We can use it on special occasion, such as the Holy Year. I rather wildly, in my annual address to the AGM, said that it had not been open since the previous Holy Year. And someone very kindly wrote to me and said that in fact it had been opened in between when Pope Francis declared the Year of Grace and Mercy, and the symbol of that was an open door, and they did open the Holy Door during that year. I was making notes from the Galician television as live broadcast, and I think what I really meant to have written, it was the last time that it was open for a Holy Year was 11 years previously. So that brings an end to what is a Holy Year. It's all rather complex, but in the end, it's about seeing, feeling that this is a good reason, a special reason to leave your home and go and experience the Camino and the cathedral, and maybe even experience the spiritual and religious dimensions, as well as the cultural and social dimensions.
Thank you
very much, Colin. Really interesting. Connecting lots of dots for me, certainly. And yes, you've shown us there's a lot more to it than just 25th of July falling on a Sunday. So thank you so much. Lots of information. I'm just gonna stop your sharing. Can I do that?
Yes, yes, don't share now.
That works. Lovely. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I won't keep us much longer, but we do have a handful of questions that have come through, if you don't mind. The first one comes from Gwen Leslie. I think you have kind of answered this already, but she has asked, are spiritual graces and indulgences only for members of the Roman Catholic Church?
Yes, and only those in good faith with it. So you have to be able to say that I am prepared to be I'm an active member. Yes. However, I would say theologically, and if you read the bishop's pastoral letter, particularly the second one, you will realize that maybe this is trapped this interpretation is trapped in a rather outdated, perhaps, view of spiritual graces. The current pastoral letter is far more generous in offering views on the benefits to people going on the Camino and arriving at the cathedral. So don't despair. It's maybe open to more than we suspect. But anyway, it's not about the church deciding who gets it. It's really God who decides in the end.
Oh, indeed, isn't that true? On the subject of the Archbishop's second letter, Omar has asked if there is a link available to look at that, or if one can look at that to reflect on it after.
As with most things on Spanish websites, it is there, but you have to work for it. I eventually found it. It's there. We will find it again, and we will perhaps send it out for people, if that's okay.
Yeah.
It is there, but it is obscure. And it is in English and other languages, but I think I had trouble downloading the English version. It took several attempts, but maybe they've corrected that. But it is there, and we'll get the link out for people.
Yes, we can send it around to everybody once we found it, so look out for that. All right, it is 8:03. Gregory, we will get back to you after this webinar, if that's okay. Yours might need a longer answer. But thank you so much again, Colin.
It's a great pleasure.
For finding all those photos as well and all those stamps.
Yes.
It was a nice way to end.
No.
And thank you all for coming. That concludes today's webinar. Next time, we will be talking about what to take with you. We have two of our fabulous volunteers, Sue and Tony, who will be giving us a practical demonstration of what to pack, how to pack, and crucially, what not to pack, from both a man and woman's perspective, bearing in mind budget, space, weight, utility. We'll be hearing all of their top tips on kit learned over the course of many Caminos and other long distance walking trails. This will be at 7 p.m. UK time on Thursday, the 29th of April. And then almost straight after that, on the Saturday, the 1st of May, we have our 6th and final Practical Pilgrim webinar of this series on the subject of staying safe. We'll be hearing from Santiago Pilgrim Office volunteer Martin Bryce about what he learned on his COVID-compliant Camino from Pamplona in late 2020. That's at 10 a.m. UK time on May 1st. And we've also got another Practical Pilgrim Zoom event being organised and hosted by one of the CSJ's regional groups, Ultra Mancunia. That has been rescheduled to the 15th of May. More information about that next time. And on, of course, our website at caminopilgrim.org/events. Until then, everyone, stay safe, buen camino. See you next time. Bye.